Good morning. I think it's pretty clear what we're covering this morning. We're in Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. And as I said, it's a parable that has three names. We'll get into it in a while. And in Luke chapter 15, if you remember, the whole chapter is Jesus is responding to the Pharisees who were complaining that he spends his time and associates with sinners and tax collectors. And in the readings that we've done through the Gospels, the interactions with the Pharisees, we've come to realize that this group was really, really negative. It was a negative experience to be next to people who are constantly complaining. And you will see how this translates today into the parable covering the oldest of the two sons. Just a question to everybody. Isn't it much more pleasant to be surrounded by positive people or by negative people? What would you prefer? Maybe you want to think about it again? No. Being surrounded by positive people fuels your day, gives you hope, and brings joy, whilst negativity and constant complaining only drains your energy and darkens the mood. Isn't it the truth? Now, if you remember, at the start of the chapter, it begins with Dr. Luke describing how the Pharisees and the teachers of the law grumbled. Now, if you check in the Greek original text, the word used there, rogizo, actually means a couple of things. It means moaned, resented, and complained, all in one. Isn't that great? Not very pleasant fellows to have around you. So when we read through the Gospels, the ministry of Jesus, many people, tend to emphasize on the miracles we read, what Jesus performed, the healings, the prominent teachings on the mountains. But there's so much to learn from Jesus, even in the subtle times, in the interactions that he has when he speaks, doesn't speak at all, for example. Think about when we go into Easter, when he surrendered himself and he didn't even speak. We have things to learn from there. Or also in times where he deals with people who are mixed up in this religious negativity. You should do this and you should do the other. And how dare you do that? How Jesus responds with those that constantly will come to hear him in order to find something negative and a fault with him. You didn't do this right. How does Jesus respond? And how does he treat these self-righteous Pharisees? We know that there have been times that he outwardly rebukes them openly to their face. But in most of the occasions, as in today as well, he spends an effort trying to teach them through parables and other sayings. Why is it that he focuses his time on the sinner, on the lost? And this is what's taking place in the whole chapter. He gives them three examples beginning in verse 1. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son. Last time we covered the first two, and today we are going to continue into what's probably one of the most well-known proverbs. The two previous parables, the one covering the lost sheep and the one covering the lost coin, build up a climactic emphasis of what Jesus wants the listeners of this parable to hear. The heart of the Father that's lovingly greeting and dealing not with one only, but with two problem sons, as we will see. So this parable, which is exclusively found in the Gospel of Luke, can be referred to and is referred to with three different names. The parable of the lost son, which would follow the narrative of the lost sheep, of the lost coin, and the lost son. The parable of the lost sons, because both of them are actually lost in their own world, as we're going to see. Or, another given name, the prodigal son. So we're picking up, read with me, from verse 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard the music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, What's going on?' 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered all your property with prostitutes, have come home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and now he is found.'" Now, this is a pretty lengthy parable in comparison with the others. And I'm sure that you've heard many a sermon upon this. It's one of the most significant parables that Jesus ever told, because it covers a lot of the important points of the gospel of grace. It talks about the love of the Father, It talks about the need for repentance. It talks about forgiveness. And it ultimately shows the purpose of Jesus' ministry that brought reconciliation between sons and daughters and their fathers. This parable is so rich in content, so many meanings, that most sermons would either focus on the youngest son, look at his actions, how he wasted the inheritance, how he repented, but eventually returned back to the father. A lesser amount of sermons would focus on the older son, who also had a very, very dysfunctional relationship with his father. And as you see, none of a relationship with his other brother. But even few sermons cover the father, which you, as you just saw, had to deal not with one only, but with two problem sons. Two rebellious sons in very different ways. This parable contains three characters. And as we've said, all the parables, as we read them, we need to listen and then identify with a character, look into the mirror, and see how that relates to us. And we cannot relate to the father. None of us is the father. If anything, we're one of the two sons. But if you remember from our last session, the emphasis in the whole chapter 15, of these parables is actually on the father. Because he is the one in all parables that searches, finds, and rejoices. In different circumstances, he rejoices with the recovery of the lost. So today, as we will go through all of which we just read, we will focus on the father. The focus needs to be on the father, obviously through examining the interactions that he has through his both sons. And we will start in reverse order. We will start with the older son. You see, the older son was very much lost himself as well. And he is a representation of the self-righteous person, a representation of the Pharisees as well, because this was spoken towards them. He is absolutely convinced that he is worthy of his father's love, worthy of his father's inheritance. Why? Because of all the work I've been doing so many years for you. And you would think he takes the responsibility of being a firstborn seriously. Yet, his own words indicate that there is a very big problem in his relationship with his father. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders." This expression in anger, his words describe his feelings about his father through the feelings for the work that he's been doing. I have been slaving for you. Meaning, he sees the work as slavery and his father more as a slave driver. Someone that just gives out orders, commands, go do this, go cut that. How many people have the same sentiment today about God? He's a remote and absent God, only giving us rules, commands to obey with. Only if I abide with all of them will I ever be accepted. How many people think that? How wrong it is. There's a very big problem with such a relationship. The older son fails to see that he also, as the younger one, is a very much loved son who one day will inherit the father's estate. If you remember, when the father said, "All I have is yours," he was talking to the older son. Very much like the Pharisees, because they, in the parable, are this son. He complains about the effort and the time and everything that the father has been asking. And more to that, he's complaining about how much time the father is spending with the lost son, the sinful, the disobedient son, totally ignoring that he at the same time is as much as at loss as his younger brother. You see, the younger brother disrespected the father and spent his inheritance, believing that joy in life is found only in possessions, money, and parties. But the older brother fails to see that what pains the father is not really the loss of the inheritance, but it was the loss of his son, not the inheritance. The older son had his part of the inheritance safe and secure. In verse 31, the father reminds the older son, "Everything I have is yours." Because according to the Jewish customs and the laws found in Deuteronomy 21, the oldest son of each family would have an additional share of the inheritance. So, for example, if you had 4 sons, the father would divide it in 5. The oldest one would get 2 shares, the rest would get 1. And in this case, being 2 sons, the older son would get 2/3 of the father's property. They would belong to him. The 1/3 would go to the youngest one. And the reason that God put that law was because the added responsibilities that were given to the oldest son. So in this case, the older brother had twice as much inheritance as the youngest son, the youngest brother. He resents him so much, he doesn't even call him by name. He doesn't even call him brother, but he refers to him when he speaks to his father as this son of yours. Not even my brother, not even George, whoever his name was. And this is the same resentment that the Pharisees had for the sinners and the tax collectors who were also sons of Israel. You see how this binds up what they did and how Jesus brings it up in a parable? The oldest son was totally unappreciated of his father's heart of compassion. He didn't enjoy that his father was a man of forgiveness. You see, possibly he could have remained content, receive his part of the inheritance, twice as much as his brother, and don't care about his younger brother at all. But no, he's angry, and he explodes on the father. He's actually so angry, as we said, that he doesn't even call him a brother. He doesn't even speak to him, similar to what the Pharisees would do to sinners and tax collectors. This son of yours has squandered your property with prostitutes. In other words, he's basically saying, I would have never done this, comparing himself to his brother. And in other words, also saying, how dare you show sympathy for a man like this after what he's done? You treat him killing the fattened calf and raise for him a party, and then it becomes all about him. What about my appreciation for my constant labor? Where's not the calf? Where's any animal that you killed on my behalf? And this behavior is very stereotypical to the religious person. Because you see, religion is a set of rules. Rules which a person believes that by following them alone, those rules and your delivering of those rules makes you accepted and appreciated by God. It is the work performed and the commands followed that establishes the relationship. That's what the religious person believes. And that's why if you ask them, are you going to heaven? They would say, I hope so, because, yesterday I did this and the other day I did that. It's all about what you do. And spoiler alert, if you want to see how much a mindset like that fights and complains against God's grace, just wait until you get to the 4th chapter of the book of Jonah, which we're going into. How Jonah responds to the Father after seeing his heart of mercy. Ephesians 2:8-9 writes, "For it is by grace that you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." You see, like the oldest son, the Pharisees and everyone who is religious in their heart boast in their religious practice and following the laws and the commands, missing completely the fact that no one can follow the law perfectly. No one can please God by following the law perfectly. In fact, the psalmist back then was right when he writes, "You do not delight in sacrifice." Hold on, wasn't sacrifice part of the law? Yes, it was. This is what he says because he understands the heart of God. "You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise." In other words, when we humble ourselves in front of God, it's like a million rules you could do and you can never achieve that. God looks at the heart of the person. Looking now into the youngest brother and how the father treats him. First of all, this young brother is wrong and disillusioned in so many ways. No wonder he is the youngest of the two brothers, because age is sometimes associated and an indication of immaturity, failing to listen to wisdom and see. And unfortunately, many people carry this immaturity in their later years. He totally disrespects his father and asks to take his part of his inheritance before he would have a rightful claim after his father's death. When do you inherit your parents' possessions? After their death. Outrageous would be the response of everyone that would be listening at this point. This parable, these words, as they're coming out of Jesus' mouth, would have hit those people. In most cases, a son showing such an outrageous behavior would be stoned to death. Now, in most cases, a son, as we said, would receive the estate of his father's after his death. But there were some times where the father would choose on his own to divide the inheritance in order to retire from managing the estates. And that is what is totally unusual, though, in this case, is that the young son comes up and initiates this division by demanding, by being arrogant and disregarding the authority that the father had in the family. In verse 13, we read that it was just a few days later that the youngest son was on his way. This shows us that he had this plan in his mind for a long time now. It was planned out. Not even a see you later. Took everything and left. He packs all his belongings and moves so far away from his family as possible. We read, he traveled to a distant land. Another spoiler alert. Isn't that like Jonah also? The listeners of this parable would have understood that this man had actually traveled and left the Jewish territory. Something that became more evident when we read he went to a different land and he ended up with pigs. You see, pigs are animals that Jews did not own because they weren't considered to be clean. They were unclean animals. No Jewish family had pigs. So this young man apparently wanted to live his life his own way, be his own master, and flee from all the rules, all the traditions, and live his life outside, not only outside his father's house, but he also left the Jewish community. And that part, that last point, disassociating himself from the community, is also a very important point in this parable, as we will see in a minute. So it was that in this distant land that he starts spending his money. Order this, another drink here, this, that, the other. Chasing what he believed would give him life, pleasures, the desires of his heart. Now, we do not know how much money he actually got from the inheritance. We do not know. But after a while, it became evident that the supply is not endless. You can very easily spend it all up. So the money dried out. And what made things worse? Right after that, it happened that a great famine hit the land. And now he doesn't even have money for the basics, for a meal, something to eat. So he said, let me become a servant for someone. And given that the only job was to feed pigs, he ended up feeding pigs, something that he would never do. He seems that he's hit rock bottom with nothing in his mouth to eat. But finally, in verse 17, the words say, he comes to his senses. He comes to his senses. No matter how far you have dropped, at some point you can come to your senses. His plan was to return back to the Father because he realized that, look, the life that I had back there wasn't that bad after all. The life that I chose, that I thought that would give me blessings, didn't end up well. It didn't fulfill me. For a Jew to stoop into feeding pigs would be a great humiliation. But to get to the point to even desire to eat the food that the pigs had touched and they were eating, that's degradation beyond any belief. Rock bottom, scraping the barrel, as we say. So with no money and no dignity, and also no claim to sonship as he thought, he desires to return back to his father's house. He says, I'll go back and beg. He thinks about it, what he's going to say to his father. Now, although you think that his motivation to return seems to be initiated because of the hunger that he had, surely there could be something to save his pride by never returning back. Perhaps he could go and find a different job or something else. And there are people that actually do this. They realize that being away from the family of God is not good for them. But their pride doesn't allow them to go back. But there's always a choice to be made. And in any situation, in your sin and in your disobedience, you can continue to go your way, extend the misery and the suffering, or you could desire and decide to go back to the Father. And in today's text we read that this young boy came to his senses. The young man's plan was to go back, apologize to his father, recognize that he has sinned against heaven and against his father. He gets one thing right when he says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But what he fails to understand is that he was never worthy to begin with. Neither of the two sons were worthy of the Father's love. They were loved because they were sons, not because they were obedient. When the younger son returned, he expected to become a hired servant. And historically, if a Jewish son lost his inheritance amongst the Gentiles, the non-Jews, the village, the community would also go out and perform what is called a kezaza ceremony. They would break a clay pot in front of him and declare him, you're cut off from the community. Kezaza, the actual name, means severing, cutting off ties. And it was a Jewish custom, a public shaming ceremony for any Jewish man who lost his inheritance to Gentiles and yet dared to return home. And it involved the community doing the rejection through the symbolic breaking of a clay pot. And then, as you know, the pot breaks in a million pieces, showing that this is a permanent separation. You can never return back here. You're an outcast. And knowing this, the Father's actions in verse 20 now take more meaning. Why did the Father run to greet his son? Running was undignified in those times, especially for a man that age. So he didn't just run because of the love and the joy of receiving his boy back, but he also did this in order to spare his son from the village to go out before them doing this ceremony and spare his son from being cut off. He ran to cover his son with grace, to protect him from the shame, and to restore him before the rejection comes from the village. And by doing this, the shame came upon him. In the context of the sinner who has rebelled against God, this cutting off, you know, God has all the rights to reject us from entering his home again, cutting us off, any community to do with him. But is this the Father's heart? No. By running to meet his son, we understand that the Father prevented the village from performing the ceremony, which is righteous. You did this to your father? You did this against the law, against us? You're never accepted here. And yet the Father took the shame upon himself. This son, the youngest son, left as a rich man with good clothes. He now returns in rags with no money. He left with the chin up in the sky, prideful, arrogant. Now his head is hanging low in sorrow and shame. He left rejecting his father. Basically, he was wishing that he was dead, the father was dead, in order to take the inheritance. And now, as the father sees the son coming, how does he feel? Compassion. As the Father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. You see, the Father goes beyond normal forgiveness and shows incredible love, not for one, but for both of the sons. You see, the younger son had rehearsed what he's going to say to the father. But if you noticed, he doesn't even get to the part about asking him to become a hired hand, a servant. And that's because the Father doesn't let him get to this point. The Father eagerly gives his servants orders to dress him up with the finest robe and accept him back in the house. In the first two parables we read in chapter 15, there's a difference, distinguishing difference to this parable. You see, in the first two, the seeker actively looks for the sheep and the coin, because those two things cannot return back by themselves. A lost coin, how can it return back by itself? A sheep, it's an animal, it doesn't understand. However, in this story, the Father is patiently waiting. God shows love and patience, waiting for us to return, people to respond, and He will not force you coming back. Very much like this parable, God waits patiently for people to repent and return home, to come to their senses. All what God wishes from you is to acknowledge that you are lost. You're lost in your sinful ways, unique. But approach Him with a humble heart and ask to be forgiven, and guess what? You're going to be welcomed back. He will open His arms. He will run out for you. You will not be scorned, and you will not be rejected. You won't have clay pots thrown at your feet. You see, the world does this, but the Father doesn't. We enter the Father's home, and sometimes we do it many times. We come and go and come and go and come and go. Not because we somehow deserve it, not because last week we were better people than the week before, but because we are loved and forgiven. Our relationship with God the Father prospers because of His love and in grace and the mercy that was shown on the cross, that Jesus died on our behalf. See, both of the sons were lost in their own way. And the Father runs out to meet them both. For the youngest, He runs out to meet him on the road as he was returning, so he doesn't face rejection from the community. For the oldest son, the Father goes out of the home and pleads with him. God rejoices when sinful people return back home. He invites even those who are religious to join the party. But note how religiosity will only lead people into anger and resentment, because their focus is what I should receive based on my slavery of following your rules. And I'm not sure in which category you may identify with, but God's heart and intentions for His sons and daughters is for you to prosper and return home. And you know what? Sometimes there's even cases where people start as the young son, lost in the world, but then end up as the older son, lost in religion. And God says, I don't want either. I just want to show you that you're my son and I love you. And this is why this last of the three parables found in Luke 15 is the most well-known, because it describes the gospel of grace in an illustration that describes in so much detail the sinner, the self-righteous, and how the Father cares for them both. To both the rebellious and the religious, God still offers today salvation because both need it. Return to His house. A few years ago, Timothy Keller wrote a book called The Prodigal God. And there he said, in this parable, the true scandal is not the young son wasting the inheritance, not the ungrateful older son either. The true scandal in the story is the extent of the Father's grace. No one would expect such grace. Undeserving sons, both of them. You see, grace is always undeserved. It is costly and humiliating, especially in an honor-shame culture. God doesn't just forgive, He pays the cost on His own for us to be able to return home. May God bless His word amongst us this morning. Amen.